Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to July 27th, Special Education Thursday. Our topic for today sounds like a lengthy one, but I think that everybody will really get a lot from it. It's understanding executive function skills deficits in students and how to help develop good IEP goals. My name is Molly Whalen, and I am the host of Special Education Thursday. I do these on behalf of Advocates for Justice in Education, or AJE, which is the parent training and information center for DC around special education. If you've listened to any of the Special Education Thursday webinars, you know that I'm also a longtime DC parent. I have two children with autism who are part of the special education and disability community here in DC. And our goal around Special Education Thursdays was to take a bite-sized piece of something within special education and try to talk about it for a half an hour and give some insight and give a little base. We try to make these pretty parent-centric, but I know we've got a lot of professionals that also join us, but we really just try to stop and say, hey, what's the topic, what's around it, and talk to a guest who is very involved in it or in that area. And then also at the end, we always like to give you a couple of resources, not a lot, but a couple of resources to go forward. So again, I think everybody's got their phone muted, and we will have the recording on the website later if you have to sign off. Without further ado, our guest is Dr. Lauren Kenworthy. She's a pediatric psychologist, and she's with the Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders with the really newly renamed Children's National Health Systems, which I remember as the Children's National Medical Center, but that's the new title. Lauren, welcome so much. I wonder if you could just start by giving a little background about your work in this area and anything you'd like to share about that.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. This is such a great idea. I love bite size. So in terms of my sort of interest and commitment in understanding and treating executive function in kids, it really developed out of my work doing a lot of neuropsychological evaluations of kids and finding these really dramatic strengths and weaknesses where there were kids who had remarkable strengths, whether it was with verbal information or visual information or memory or learning, but weren't really able to kind of show what they know in school or even at home in terms of daily routines. And that turns out to often be an issue of executive function problems. And executive function problems can have a really big impact on kind of the outcomes that I, as a parent, care the most about, which is, are my kids going to become those happy, well-functioning 21-year-olds? Are they going to be able to have a job? Are they going to have relationships? And executive functions are so important to those outcomes that I feel very excited to be able to talk about them as well as to study them and understand where they go wrong and then what we can do to help them improve in kids.
So let's start at the beginning. I think more and more, I know it, myself as a parent, I started hearing these pieces in IEP meetings, but I think we hear it more in school about this. What is executive functioning skills? Like, what is that? And what does that look like in children?
So I think the first thing to know about executive functions is they are a brain-based set of abilities. So they look different in different people based on both the genetics of your brain and what things you may have been exposed to. They grow out of this, what we call distributed networks in the brain. So these big networks of neurons throughout the brain that turn out to be very vulnerable because they have this long developmental period. They develop over the first 3 decades of life. So there's this long period when your executive functions are coming online, and also there's this long period in which you can mess them up. And so what that means is that a lot of kids and adults in the world have some executive function issues, and functionally, executive functions are about the efficiency with which we can carry out goal-directed behavior and about how we effectively process information. So they're not about what we know as much about what we do with what we know. So how do we do life? How do we learn new things? How do we carry out routines? Those are all dependent on good executive skills.
So one thing that I'd love to make sure that we hit on, and because I think this is true, and if I'm wrong about this, please correct me. Executive functioning skills isn't really an intelligence factor, right? It doesn't, like if you're really bad at executive functioning skills, doesn't mean that you're not smart, right?
Absolutely. So
it looks like that, right?
In fact, there's some very, very smart people who have terrible executive function skills, right? And that sort of stereotype of the absent-minded professor who really couldn't make it through the day without, usually it's a he and it's usually his wife who's then doing all those things to help him function. That's a classic case where you have very high IQ and very poor executive functions. You can also see the opposite. You can see kids whose IQ scores are lower. They may be slower learners, but they're actually pretty organized and they're able to focus and stay on task with things. And those are executive skills.
And it seems to me that, and I've always used it as an example because I think for parents who have school-age kids, it comes into, we know they know how what their homework is, but they don't seem to be able to get it done. You know, we're looking at math and algebra or adding, and we know they know what the numbers of 2 plus 5 are, but they just sit and stare at the homework. Is that a good example of like what identifying it in a student?
Those are perfect examples because you see executive function problems when people do something new or unfamiliar, or when they have to do it more independently. So bringing the homework home and then doing at home what they've already learned how to do at school, that's a big executive function demand. You know, if you think about adults, you can just think about the fact that your executive functions are in more demand as situations require you to do more multitasking to manage more information at once. So going into a grocery store, that requires a lot of executive functions. You know, if you didn't plan well before you went to the store, you don't know what you need, you won't be as efficient. You may be smart enough to grocery shop, but you won't be as efficient at it. If your working memory's poor and you have trouble keeping track of what you already put in the cart, you know, your grocery shopping won't be as effective. And the same thing happens to kids around things like homework, getting ready for school in the morning, you know, carrying out any number of routines. For academics, it's often those multi-step tasks, maybe writing a paragraph, not just reading, but then reading for meaning is where we see a lot of executive issues.
And do most, okay, so, you know, we're obviously talking special ed. Do most kids with disabilities have executive functioning skills deficits, or is this kind of a, hey, it happens throughout, you know, children?
So that's kind of a yes and yes answer.
Okay.
Because like I said, it's very vulnerable. It's the most vulnerable function in our brain. So all of us have had the experience of a day where our executive functions weren't very good. If we were very stressed out by, you know, a death in the family and didn't sleep well the night before, if we didn't eat our breakfast, or, you know, any number of things will degrade your executive functions. And that happens to adults and kids alike. Growing up in poverty is a direct driver of having poorer executive functions, and there's some dramatic data on that. But it also comes with a lot of developmental disabilities. So autism, ADHD are strongly associated with executive function problems, but kids with reading disabilities often have working memory and other related executive problems, and so we see it in a lot of different conditions.
Okay. And then I would imagine this must be a huge problem in schools. I mean, if this is kind of affecting, you know, student movement throughout the school building and in the classroom. So do you hear that a lot from families, just, you know, frustration of the school situation?
Yes. So because school, your kid is being put into a larger group, that demands more executive function skills. Your kid's job every day in school is to learn something new. That demands more executive function skills. And, you know, what happens for a lot of kids is kind of what you were alluding to, Molly, where the fact that a kid may be very verbal or seem to be clearly mastering the material in a subject, but yet isn't producing the work,
Mm-hmm.
tends to drive people towards this false attribution where we say, well, that kid just won't do that work versus saying that kid can't do that work.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, at the crux of the biggest problem that happens in a lot of school-based settings as well as at home and, other places too. But that's sort of the most fundamental first step in terms of thinking about how executive functions may be affecting your child is everybody's got to get clear on the fact that executive function problems are like any other learning disability. They make it harder for you to do the assigned task, and as a result, you really can't do it in the way the teacher thinks you should be able to do it. And until we get away from the won'ts, we're going to be very ineffective at helping that kid do better. We will teach that kid to have a negative self-view of themselves, and we'll really limit the tools we have to teach them what they need to overcome those executive problems.
So how do we identify this? I definitely want to get to what can teachers and schools and families do, but how do we know a student has executive function skills deficits?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways to know that, and there's a couple kind of layers to what you do to answer that question. I think as parents, for any of us who are looking at our kids and seeing moments where it's clear they actually want to do something, but are struggling to make it happen, even though they know what technically they should do, we need to ask that executive function question.
It's not just we know they hate math, so they're not doing it, but we know they really want to succeed, and yet it's just not coming out. We know they know these numerical problems. If we said them out loud and played a game with it, they could do that adding, but they're just not. They're sitting there staring at the paper, and it's not laziness or anything else.
Right. So when we have a hunch that that's going on, then we get to do a little experiment with that single child of figuring out, if I support that person's executive functions, do they suddenly do what they're having trouble doing, right? So if I put the worksheet in front of my kid and he's looking out the window and, trolling through his phone, Twitter feed, then my first step is to say, well, what if I say, and I'm speaking about my own kids here who have ADHD, what if I say, okay, buddy, let's just cover up most of the worksheet, let's look at the one first problem, and I want you to get that problem done, and let's make it a race. Can you do it in the next minute? If he sits down and does it, right, then I suddenly have some evidence that it's not that he doesn't want to do it, it's that he can't do it in the form in which it is being presented to him.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'd love to share a little story. As everybody knows, I do this all the time, but homework was so difficult for my youngest autism and ADHD child. And we kind of got in this agreement with the school that said, hey, if we can get her to do something, is that okay? And they said, sure. So we would have her take a whatever color highlighter she wanted. Instead of 20 problems on the worksheet, she got to choose whichever one she wanted. And it wouldn't be in a row. It wouldn't be at the end. It would be all these all over. And then she worked, pink highlighted those and then worked through those 5 that she agreed to. And I guess I didn't realize we were kind of supporting executive functioning skills, but I think we were, if that's what in your description.
You were absolutely, and a key thing you were doing, and it sounds like you were able to convince your school to do, but some schools struggle with this, was you were acknowledging it's harder for her to do all 20 problems. It's an acceptable accommodation for her to do fewer number of problems. Because in some schools, they're still stuck on the won't idea, and she is capable of doing all 20, so we need to make her do that. And I try to have people think about, if you have a bad knee and somebody is trying to steal your wallet, you're probably going to run that 50-yard dash pretty fast, right? But that doesn't mean you can do that every day, day after day. And people get confused about that with the executive function problems and think, well, why can't she do all of them if she can do some of them? Well, that's where her bad knee, her limp is coming in, where she cannot sustain that work over the whole length of the worksheet.
Yes. And when we're talking about our kids, it gets exhausting and frustrating, and they feel that self-worth piece. So it sounds like that's really something that, and I'd love to reiterate it. Everybody knows I do this with the Thursdays too. I make you repeat things because I think it's so good. But reiterating, when we think about what schools and teachers can do with these kids who are struggling, can you talk about the can't, not, won't concept? I think it's really wonderful to think of it.
Yeah, and I agree it's fundamental. And so I've kind of, over time, come to be a little bit more direct about this in schools. So if I'm sitting, for instance, in an IEP meeting, and I start to hear language like, well, he's refusing to do that, he's so stubborn, he doesn't care, he's lazy, those kinds of what I think of as moral turpitude words, bad kid words, then I try to kind of directly call people on that and say, so you're saying that he won't do that he won't do that work that we're talking about right now, not that he can't. And often just being very explicit helps people to stop and think about the assumptions that they're making. But until they do that, you can put in any number of accommodations, and they won't have a big impact because they're not being used in the way, they're not being used based on the understanding of what's going on with that kid's brain.
And I think it's useful. I mean, I've often said this as a parent, but I think I've said it to teachers too, because I really do love the can't, not, won't. That how do you look at that child differently if you think about that thing that they're not doing in the terms of that child can't do it, not that child won't do it? And how would you be, as a parent and a teacher, work differently with that child? If you know that child cannot do that worksheet, how as a teacher would you change it, as opposed to, if they won't, let's all be honest, if they won't, we're just going to scold them and then roll our eyes, or, I mean, even me as a parent would do that. But if we think, gosh, they really can't, so what can I do that makes it different? Can I have them stand up? Can I have them, do 10 jumping jacks? Can I have them say, okay, there's 20 here, you choose a number and you do those? So it really, to me, is like such a key thing for any teachers and professionals listening, that just taking a minute and going, is this a can't, not, won't, and what would I do differently if it was a can't?
Yeah, I love that, Molly. I think that's a very positive way to frame it. And the other thing I would just add is that to help people recognize, often by reframing it as a can't, you are not only empowering the kid to work on what they can't do, but yourself. You now have more options, right? Yeah. Because the worst situation is where a kid is stuck on something that they really can't do, and the teacher or therapist or parent is stuck on making them do that. And so I do get very concrete. It's like, if a child has a reading disability, you do not make them sit in during recess to finish the book. You say, you can't decode words. You're not reading because you can't decode words. I'm going to teach you how to decode words. And so we need to have the same approach where, we're not locked into a power struggle that we're never going to win, right? You will not beat a person into overcoming a learning disability. But getting out of that power struggle into, well, how can we figure out how you can do this?
So let's get into as I said, the time flies on these. We could always do them so much longer. But what would IEP goals look like in this area? If you were doing IEP goals, and maybe that's too broad, and choose a specific type of kid if that's easier. But what are some specific IEP goals or areas that you would put in under executive functioning skills deficit?
So, and I'll tell you, one of the reference materials that we were going to show at the end is a book that in the appendix has sample IEP goals for people to look at, because I wrote those because I've been so frustrated because schools have no idea how to do this. So there's a couple principles when you're writing an IEP goal around executive function that are really important. And one is to get away from this idea that the child is missing a piece of knowledge that a teacher is going to give to them and therefore fix their executive function problems. Because we do these study skills classes sometimes, and it's like, I'm just going to tell you that you need to color code your notebook and write your assignments down every day. And now that you know that that's what you need to do, you're going to be able to go do it. Right. Kids know that they need to write their assignments down every day. The executive dysfunction part is they can't do it. So we need to make sure that people are teaching executive functions the way they teach a sport or an instrument. It's a coaching kind of model. You're going to show the skill. You're going to have the kid try the skill out. They're going to mess it up. That doesn't mean that you're not teaching it correctly. It means that this is a process that you do over time with a lot of demonstration, what we call scaffolding or support, and then you fade away the adult support very slowly as you see the kid mastering the skill. So more like what you did when you taught your kid to ride a two-wheeler than when you taught your kid, about history or how to solve a math problem.
So I put up on the screen, I think you're talking about Unstuck and Untarget, right? And Solving Executive Function Challenges, those two books?
Yeah, the Solving Executive Function Challenges book is the one that in the appendix has the sample IEP goals.
Okay, so we've got those up, and then at the end I'll also show both available on Amazon.com and I think some other book places. The one question I also wanted to ask about IEP goals is, and I've always been curious about it, who tends to work on those? Is that a more special ed teacher area, or is that more of a therapeutic, maybe an OT or a speech therapist?
Most often it's the special educator. Sometimes it's the psychologist/counselor in the school system. OTs tend to have such small amounts of time in a lot of schools that we haven't seen that happen, but private OTs do a lot of this work.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And then is there a difference in, I wanted to kind of target, like some of these kids who've had these issues have had them for a long time, but we're not seeing them until maybe later school age, where the work is getting heavier and faster and moving. So maybe more that junior high. So are there a difference between what you would do for IEP goals for like younger kids versus older kids, like middle school and high school, or not really?
Well, the content changes, but, we're developing Unstuck as a spiraling curriculum because just like reading or math, executive function skills you have to learn as you move through school and as what you have to use them for changes. So the principles, and if you look at the appendix, you'll see this, are that you have to write into the IEP goal the process of teaching. So you say things like given training, practice, visual supports, fading adult cueing, right? Uh-huh. Those are the principles for how they're going to teach it. But then what the specific thing is that you want the person to learn does change with age, right? So you might have a goal for an elementary school child that is about, you want that child to learn to be more flexible, and so you want them to learn a certain flexibility vocabulary, like big deal, little deal, plan A, plan B, and you want them to use that when they're starting to get upset about something in the classroom.
Okay, so that gets into that social emotional piece there, is being able, and again, that's kind of the getting back to executive functioning challenges. It's about how you're navigating life too, not just getting through academics.
Absolutely. Executive function and social emotional regulation are very heavily overlapping, right? To the extent that we talk about executive function as how you regulate your thinking, your behavior, and your feelings.
Mm-hmm. And so, and I definitely want to, at the end, I'll try to, we kind of goggled around the presentation and get back to some of these slides, because I know you guys are doing some great research projects and we want to emphasize those. But before we get into kind of the resources, I'd love to hear, Lauren, what you wish parents knew about executive functioning challenges. What do you wish they knew? And maybe it's something different. I was going to say for professionals. What do you wish teachers knew about them?
That's a really interesting question, Molly. I haven't quite thought about it that way. I think the thing that I find most powerful in the work I do, and I do a lot of neuropsychological assessments where I'm probing executive function, are the moments when a parent can suddenly kind of see that their child is processing information really differently. And I think for me as a parent, as well as for the parents I work with, the hardest thing is to recognize, our kid our beautiful child who is good at this and good at this, but they actually really process information differently than the way you are, and that changes their ability to do certain things, because that's a very powerful moment.
Wow, that's really neat. Yeah, and really, thinking that. And then about with teachers, would you love to be able to say, like, a new batch of teachers, what would you tell them about executive function skills in this area?
The key thing, and we see this because we work in schools around these unstuck intervention projects we do, is when teachers realize, oh, this is something that every kid in my class needs. Maybe so-and-so, who's the identified child with the IEP, needs it a little bit more so, but what I do for that child's going to help everybody in the class. Then it's like the light bulb goes off, and they realize, yeah, okay, it's a little bit of work to incorporate some new vocabulary or to, point people back to goals and plans, but actually the whole classroom then moves more smoothly and easily. And then often what we get is teachers saying, I want to do this everywhere, and I want to do this with my kindergartners as well as my, the first grade class in which we've been working on these skills, for instance.
Well, and it's really giving kids a way to, and I love using that term, way to navigate through life. Like, how do I navigate this? It's all this data coming in, and I don't know how to manage it or work it through, and in those different areas, and we see it so often. And we're trying to, and I think there's so much of it doing it also eliminates those frustrations and then behaviors as well.
Right, and that you get, for both parents and teachers, with some upfront work, because as we know, coaching, teaching instruments, those aren't easy things, right? They take effort, but with that upfront effort, we get this much smoother running machine, whether it's the classroom or the home. And I think the other thing that people realize is, oh, these techniques actually help me, even me as the adult, or, they help me with my mother-in-law, or, whoever it may be, that these are very universal principles.
That's great. Okay, so let's get on to some of these slides. We've talked, right now I'm showing the Unstuck and On Target, which is more of the teacher's curriculum book. And then on the right is Solving Executive Function Challenges, which is a little bit more the parent book. Is that right, or am I saying that wrong?
Absolutely. The book on the left is a curriculum, so I wouldn't expect a parent to do that at home, but a therapist could do it, a teacher, anybody ideally who has a small group of kids who they want to work on flexibility, goal-oriented problem-solving planning. The book on the right is actually for teachers or parents or therapists, but it's for people who aren't going to teach a curriculum, don't have time to do lessons, but they just want to incorporate the language of executive function into their daily lives.
Right, and that's the one that has the IEP goals, sample IEP goals.
At the back, yes.
And then let me get in here. Let me jump back before we get to resources, and either you or Yetta can jump in. So I'm on the page about CASD's participants about the Unstuck and On Target parent training. So do you guys want to tell us a little bit about that?
Hi, Molly. It's Yetta. Hello, guys. So basically, we're currently recruiting for 2 research studies, our Unstuck and On Target parent training, which is for children with ASD 8 to 12. And basically, contact information is there. You can reach out to me if you have questions. But basically, the Unstuck and On Target curriculum is going to be available in both an online and a in-person. We're basically comparing the two. So families are going to be randomly assigned. But if you're interested, like I said, you can reach out to me or Chelsea, whose name is at the bottom of the flyer.
And this is available to DC parents and parents around the DMV, right?
Exactly. So they can come in for a baseline test. If they haven't been here with us at CASD, gone through testing here, and then there's going to be 9 modules for online and 2 2-hour sessions if you're chosen for in-person.
Okay. All right. Let's just look through these, and then if people are interested. The other one is using MRI technology to study executive functioning. Can you just give us a little bit about that if somebody wants to recommend a family?
So basically, it's for ages 8 to 13. This is a project in collaboration with Georgetown. So again, if you're interested, you can reach out to me or Meredith, who's at the whose information is at the bottom of the flyer.
Okay. And then our Sesame Street Muppets and Julia.
Exactly. So so this is basically one of my favorite tasks that I put together. Every month we create a online an e-newsletter called CASB Chat, and this particular chat highlights the work that we've done with our Sesame Street See Amazing research project, where we looked at from families who have children 0 to 5, what the Sesame Street website, how it looked, what families were, finding out about autism, both parents with autism and without. And all of this, culminated back in April with Julia the Muppet coming out. So it was a huge project.
Yes,
families all across the country participated. So thanks if you were one of those families who participated.
So just real quick, because of the people on the phone, we've got some professionals. Are those resources and the ebook, We Are Amazing 123, still available?
They are available on sesamestreet.org/autism.
Okay, so that's a great one.
In Spanish.
Yeah, that's a great one for folks to go to if they want, if they have especially young children with autism in their schools, to get some great resources. And again, you can come back and look at these slides after we set the recording. We talked about Unstuck and Untarget. And then I think we've got resources now. Can you tell us about, we've talked about Sesame Street and autism, but can you tell us about the other three?
So obviously, Dr. Kenworthy is she's the director of the Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders. That's our website there. I also, in addition to serving as the community outreach coordinator, started a nonprofit back in 2009-2010 called DC Autism Parents. So if parents are on the line who have a child with autism, need additional resources, you can reach out to me that way. I'm also the Learn the Signs Act Early Ambassador for the District of Columbia. So that is resources for families who have children 0 to 5 who are just interested in, developmental monitoring, great information. They have free books, materials so that you can monitor your child's development. And again, if you're interested in any of CASB's research studies, or if you'd like to sign up for CASB Chat, please feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. Lauren and Yetta, thank you so much. We're going to sign off. We're just over a little bit on time, and, I like to keep it to the 30 minutes. Thanks, everybody, for participating. If you came in late and want to hear the whole recording, we'll have it up on the AJE website shortly. Hopefully by this afternoon, maybe tomorrow. For sure. Also, we are going to take August off. We do special education Thursdays every other Thursday, so we're going to take August off and come back in the first week of September. And we have a colleague of Dr. Kenworthy's and Yetta's from the Ivy Mount School, Monica Adler-Werner, and we're going to talk about social and emotional learning and goals. So there'll be a nice kind of follow-up from this one. So you can join us at any time or go on to the aje-dc.org website to listen to the recordings. Thanks, everybody. Signing out.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.